Hey everybody. Hey, thanks for joining today. Hey, today I went a little bit different, and I kind of just wanted to do something very specific, in relation to mental illness. So I decided today to kind of go a little more in depth with borderline personality disorder. And I think this is a disorder, it is very serious mental disorder, and it's not really talked about a lot, and not too many people really know, kind of what it is. So, without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and get into it. Right, so borderline personality disorder, it's a classification. It's classified under a serious, mental illness. And this, it typically has components such as, instability, mood swings, a poor sense of self, a poor image, kind of just erratic behavior, just kind of like all over the place. And it actually affects a very low number of people. It affects only about 2% of, the adult population. The major factor here that is probably the worst component of this disorder is the instability factor. And I say this because the instability tends to disrupt, family life and, work life and long-term plans or relationships. Anything that you would think you could plan for in life is disrupted by the instability. Okay, so basically, it's considered borderline personality disorder is sort of like it's considered the border of, psychosis and neurosis. And, we all know, of course, that, psychosis it's a very difficult period where the individual has a hard time distinguishing fantasy from reality. So things that, that it's common hallucinations, delusions, falsely fixed held beliefs, with conviction, contrary to all this other evidence, and it is kind of sad. It really is. And these hallucinations and these delusions become so real that there's no way of talking, these type of individuals out of it. But it is very sad, but basically, the problem here is they suffer because they have difficulty, borderline personality, disorder individuals, they have difficulty regulating their emotions. Okay. And also we had discussed this in an earlier video, the attachment theory style. And so this would not be a form of a secure attachment. So it's either going to be an insecure attachment or it's going to be an avoidant type, somewhat. So let's just go ahead and kind of, get into the symptoms of it. Okay. Basically, really borderline personality disorder, the symptoms, it's, bouts of anger. It's bouts of like depression and anxiety, and these can last anywhere, from maybe a few hours to no more than a few days. So it's kind of like, up in the air. Your guess is as good as mine. But many of these episodes, they have components of, impulsivity. They have components of aggression. They have components that a lot of times are further triggered by, drug and alcohol. Or, induced, or drug and alcohol, substance abuse problems, which a good portion of borderline personality disorder kind of fall in that category too. They tend to have drug and alcohol related problems, which I'm going to kind of get into in a few minutes. But basically it's really distortions of their own mentality, of their thoughts, of their image of themselves. It's a poor sense of self. It's a poor sense of identity. Okay, so basically the whole mentality here is that people who suffer from borderline personality disorder, they view themselves fundamentally as bad, as unworthy, and just overall, bad people, and at times they feel bored, they feel empty, they feel lonely, a lot of times they feel misunderstood, or, wrongly or unjustly, mistreated and things like that. The sad thing about this is that in actuality, I'd probably say 95% of the individuals that have borderline personality disorder, they have no idea who they even are as a person. So we can kind of see a little bit how that overlaps here. I mean, you really have to think about it. Like, if you, let's try to put ourselves, in that situation when you're, especially when you're growing up, if you lack the essential building blocks and you just really kind of, float and kind of bounce and dangle through life, and you really have no sense of identity or self or who you are as an individual, you sort of are kind of lost in the world. And it's kind of like that old phrase, I'm small like a penny in the big world, but I am worthwhile and important. And, sadly, not everybody feels that way. you know. But a lot of times, you know, they'll feel isolated. They are lacking in social support. And a lot of times, and I've noticed too, this actually tends to affect women more than it does men, surprisingly. You know, but they, especially with the men, they tend to have very frantic efforts to avoid being alone. So, you know, and that, you know, we can kind of see that that does kind of stem, you know, a little bit from, you know, depression and, you know, things like that. But the big component here is how much this does affect relationships. So we're going to go ahead and get into that next. Okay, borderline personality disorder and relationships. Basically, they're classified as highly unstable relationships. I mean... wishy-washy does not even describe it. I mean, these are like, these are individuals that develop intensely, you know, attachments, yet it's just a stormy, you know, relationship, you know, overall. You know, and this kind of is where the shift occurs, okay? Borderline personality disorder individuals, they are not like a normal individual in the sense that a normal individual can, you know, kind of regulate negative, positive, you know, emotions and things like that. Borderline personality individuals cannot. So they either have to be one or the other. They're either going to have an attachment and idolize, or you are going to move down and be devalued. So really it's kind of like a shift from, you know, this great idolization to instant devaluation. You know, and that is kind of sad. And we also discussed that yesterday too. A lot of true narcissists also fall in this category, you know, in the sense that, you know, they cannot idolize someone for too long. So, you know, a lot of narcissists, if I don't know if you've seen any of the other videos, but, a lot of the traits kind of fall in here, you know, so it's kind of, you know, a little heads up. But basically, they, they are unable, to form, when a conflict or a separation occurs for someone, you know, who has borderline personality disorders, this to them is a huge blow to their ego. This is certainly, it's like taking a wrench and it is rocking somebody's world, like, oh my gosh. Basically, and the type of attachment, this is kind of why they go back and forth. Because it seems almost like every decision that, you know, the other party is making, borderline personality disorder individuals take this differently. It is perceived differently. It is perceived as, you know, disappointment. It is perceived as abandonment. So it's really, you know, all really a matter, you know, of perception. But to them, it is one way. That's how it is, you know. So we have to also take that into consideration too a little bit. You know, so, and a lot of times I also compare, you know, borderline personality disorder to a light switch in the sense that, you know, they can suddenly switch and they can become very, very angry, or, you know, they'll start accusing the other party of not caring for them at all. So it's kind of like a light switch, you know, that goes on and off, you know. Oh, great, I love you, I'm idolizing you. Psh, you never care for me at all, I hate you. You know, so it's a little rough, you know, so really you're just kind of juggling in between two modes here. But basically, as I stated earlier, borderline personality disorder individuals must switch back and forth. Idolization, devaluation. You know, there is no, you know, both at the same time, like a normal brain would function. They are highly sensitive to rejection. Okay. So, and like I said, true narcissists also fall in this category. The way that they react to, you know, distress, and, you know, they react with anger, and this can be to any mild, you know, situation or anything like that. So when they react and they're angry, in their mind, it triggers a domino effect of negative feelings, negative ideas, negative emotions, negative thoughts, you know, and so it's kind of just like, it just propels. And it just gets worse and worse. You know, but another component here too also is they have a huge fear of abandonment. So, you know, they have difficulties, you know, feeling emotionally connected to someone. You know, they tend to feel, you know, kind of lost in the world or worthless, you know, and it's often, as I was stating earlier, you know, perceived abandonment. You know, it's disappointments, it's, you know, different things like that. Like hypothetically, let's say, you know, they were dating someone and their schedule got switched around. Okay, well, the individual with borderline personality disorder is going to turn around like, oh my gosh, you switched that schedule. You don't want to be near me. And it's like, my schedule just like got changed. You know what I mean? So it's kind of, you know, it takes a little bit of work to deal with these people. They have a huge, knack for impulsiveness. They engage in, adrenaline, hedonistic, attention-seeking behavior. They, have lots of sexual partners. They engage in risky sex and things like that. But this is also coupled with other psychiatric problems. And with that, I'm talking about bipolar disorder. I'm talking about, depression. I'm talking about, anxiety disorder. I'm talking about substance abuse, drug and alcohol disorder. I'm also talking about, anything that's emotionally inept, whether or not, it was from a caregiver or some type of psychological or emotional trauma, definitely also plays a trigger. But some causes of borderline personality disorder, I kind of want to get into a little bit. The funny thing about this is, too, that a lot of the causes, they're relatively unknown. So we can't really definitively pinpoint and say, okay, this causes this causes this. That's kind of why it's a little hard to profile and identify. But basically, scientists and psychologists have agreed that, they believe it's two parts. As we discussed earlier, nature versus nurture. It is genetic, but it's also environmental. So, it's several things combined together, to kind of make one. But generally, people that are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, they tend to have a 5-time higher chance of passing it down to their children. And generally this is because it is passed down. They have the 5% higher chance of it being passed down in their family. So that kind of leads us to say, okay, hey, maybe it is genetic. And that would make sense. The correlation here, a lot of the studies have also showed that there is a correlation between borderline personality disorder and a history of neglect, separation, abandonment issues. And there's also been history of abuse, whether or not it be physical, emotional, and sexual. 71% of borderline personality disorder patients have admitted to being sexually abused by a non-caregiver. And, that is very sad. So it's a combination really of just individual vulnerability and environmental stress. It's a series of events that has triggered this onset in adulthood, and it's only in adulthood that it can trigger. So it's kind of like one thing after another that snowballs, and then in adulthood, boom, like you kind of just snap, and it's difficult. But basically, they have a poor partner selection, and they kind of put themselves in a situation with a poor lifestyle, and things like that. A lot of this also, a contributing factor too, that I want to get into a little bit is neuroscience. And with that, it's saying that people that are predispositioned to have borderline personality disorders, which would be the nature aspect, we're born that way. Basically, they have an impaired regulatory system inside of their brain, the amygdala, which is a small, almond-shaped portion in your brain that regulates negative emotions. Okay, so that's a little bit, so it's impaired. So it's not working as it would for someone else, and so that's a very, very important component here. The prefrontal cortex, you have your temporal, your frontal, parietal, and occipital lobe. The prefrontal cortex is actually, it's pretty important, pertaining to the amygdala, because what happens here is, the prefrontal cortex, the more skilled we are and able to use it, the better, skills, mentality, and mindset that we have to use this. This can actually help predict further negative emotions pertaining to the amygdala in the brain. But unfortunately, borderline personality individuals, they tend to lack this. So it is very difficult to kind of, say, hey, what is the trigger? When is this going to happen? Are there signs? So on and so forth. But serotonin, norepinephrine, they're, the messengers that play the role in regulation of emotions, kind of like the synaptic gap. It's like a baseball mitt, and you have the baseball, and it, because neurons in your brain, they either fire a charge or they don't. Okay, if they fire, it's positive. If they don't, it's negative. And a lot of times dopamine, too much firing the positive, leads to schizophrenia, we discussed before. But basically, it's an imbalance, a lot of it. Also, another important factor here is that people with high blood pressure and diabetes tend to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder a little bit more. So that's always interesting. Therapy, we can do cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral modification, psychodynamic therapy, try mood stabilizers such as maybe, Depakote or Tegretol, that sort of thing, antipsychotic drugs, if they're having an episode, that sort of thing. All in all, these are only going to mask and downplay the symptoms. They will not stop it. So as always, you guys, thank you for joining. And if you have any questions, hit me up. We're going to have a great discussion tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.